So we'll kick off. We've got a fairly relaxed session today. We're gonna talk a little bit about what Microsoft launched 11 months ago with Visual Studio 2022. I will never understand why we launched 2022 in 2021, but it's all good. We'll also talk about the 3 minor version updates that we've launched in the last 3 years. So we're currently on Visual Studio 17.3. What that means is that we've fixed some bugs and we've changed some things that developers didn't like back to what we had in 2019. And we've taken some functionality that was in preview this time last year and we've made it kind of default behavior in Visual Studio. So if you did join this session this time last year, this will be pretty familiar for you, with a couple of updates and a couple of changes as we go through, depending on what's changed. So give us a quick show of hands if you are a developer. A good number of us. What about if you're not a developer, but you still feel at home when you open Visual Studio? That's where I'm going to put my hand up. So I am an engineer in the app innovation team here at Microsoft. A big part of my role is working with our customer and partner developer community, particularly in the enterprise space, to help them to get the best out of not only Microsoft Cloud, but also our developer tooling as well. And as you would expect, Visual Studio plays kind of a big part in that. So here at Microsoft and across the industry as a whole, really, we have this notion of developer velocity. This idea of driving business productivity, delivering value to organizations by empowering developers. Ultimately, it's the developers that are making things, that are pushing code out, and that are delivering value to end users, whether that is directly to your own customers or through end users of your products. And for us here at Microsoft, the journey to developer velocity brings together our best-in-class developer environment. I'm biased, I'm going to say best-in-class, Visual Studio, with the world's largest open source community in GitHub, and also Microsoft's developer cloud across the Microsoft 365 and Azure. But we're here today to focus on Visual Studio, and in particular what's new in Visual Studio 2022. So as I mentioned, we made Visual Studio 2022 generally available about 11 months ago. It was the beginning of November. And it was all about continuing the journey from 2019, empowering developers around the world to deliver value to their organizations and end users. In today's session, we're going to dive into 3 core value propositions for Visual Studio. We're going to have a look at the new and improved tooling for modern application development. We're going to look at how Visual Studio drives productivity with unparalleled scale and performance. And then finally, we're going to unpack a new collaboration tooling with a greenfield Git experience that's been built new for Visual Studio. If we get time, we'll also have a look at some of our AI-enabled tooling with Visual Studio IntelliCode, and towards the end we'll have a chat about kind of what that means around things like GitHub Copilot as well. There's enough of us in the room. That sound good? Nods all round. Cool. I can't wait for the day that someone says no and they want to change the agenda at this point, but it's all good. So across modern application development, the first pillar that we want to focus in today, there's kind of 3 key aspects that we want to dive into. The first is building cloud-native applications and leveraging cloud services to modernize the full application stack. Next up, .NET 6 and the native tooling that we've built in Visual Studio to help developers build any type of application using .NET 6. Quite interesting talking about that given that .NET 7 is just around the corner, but we'll focus in on 6 for today. And then finally progressing the cross-platform development story with C++ applications, embedded workloads and games. So we've been focusing in on reducing the friction for developers to take their code and get it to where they need it to be. Whether that's running in the cloud, whether that's running across cross-platform devices, wherever it needs to be, we want to help them get it there as quickly as possible. In terms of the cloud, Microsoft has rebuilt all of our Azure Services SDKs to drive more consistency in the data model and the functionality to make it easier for developers to consume those services. And we're creating new experiences in Visual Studio to help developers to build and deploy applications into modern environments like Azure Container Apps and Azure Functions on Linux. So from enabling cross-platform unit testing with remote environments to generating GitHub action workflows from directly in the developer environment, we continue to provide best-in-class built-in tooling to enable developers and engineers to shift left in their development practices. Not sure how many of you have adopted GitHub Actions, but I remember the first day opening GitHub Actions in the browser and having to write that YAML file in the built-in text editor, and it was horrible. And we're going to have a look at some demos of kind of some of the functionality we've built into Visual Studio to help make that experience a little bit easier for us to onboard. As I mentioned, .NET 6, we launched .NET 6 as our long-term supported version again around November time last year. And Visual Studio 2022 is the only Visual Studio full-fat version that supports .NET 6 natively. There are updates to enable building any application with .NET 6, including support for .NET MAUI, Hot Reload, and Live Preview, with the ability for us to target cross-platforms, to run our unit tests, to hit F5 and debug our applications, whether they are on Linux, macOS, or Windows. And as we've continued to iterate on Visual Studio 2022 over the last year, we've also introduced native support for C#11 with refactoring for functionality like raw string literals. So we'll dive into a bit of a demo here. By the way, we've got some time scheduled at the end for any questions, so if you've got anything, keep a note of it. We'll make sure that we get around to doing some questions at the end as well. So we're all here to see Visual Studio, not PowerPoint, so let's have a look at some functionality that we've got here. The first thing I mentioned was around that kind of GitHub Actions experience. And if we think back to kind of when GitHub Actions was first launched, I would write some code, I would check it into my Git repository, I'd push it up into GitHub Actions, and then I'd go and click that button in GitHub that says create pipeline or create workflow. And then I would have to kind of figure out what action do I need, what steps do I need, what technologies am I using, what version am I using, etc. And we wonder why developers right-click publish all the time. We want to kind of reduce that friction and make it easier. So one of the things that we've introduced in Visual Studio 2022 is the ability to right-click publish to a CI/CD pipeline. So we can go here, take our web application, right-click and publish. And normally at this point, we would click a cloud service or a remote virtual machine, and we would deploy that directly into IIS. And instead, go and just undo all of that. We'll remove the Blue Peter style one I did earlier. Apologies for this. Let's do. Okay, cool. Okay, so we're going to go into our web application. We can go ahead and do our right-click publish. It's going to ask us where we want to deploy this to. I'm going to select Azure. We have the option to then choose where we want to deploy this to. In Visual Studio 17.2, which is essentially the second iteration of 2022, we can see that we've introduced Azure Container Apps, so we have the ability to go and pipe this into a native Container Apps environment. For the purpose of this demo, I'm going to go ahead and select Azure App Service. And it's going to ask me to select my development environment that I want to deploy. And now you can see we've got two options. The new one that we've introduced in 2022 is to publish this using a GitHub action workflow. So we can go ahead and select this, click Finish, give that a second, And then if we go and have a look at the changes that have been made here locally, we can see that our GitHub action, or at least the starting point for our GitHub Actions workflow, has been written and everything's ready for us to go. Now there's a couple of things that go into making this happen, from checking the versions of the SDK and the runtime that we're using, having a look at any additional dependencies, and then making sure that we've kind of authored this to a point that if I now check this into my Git repository, push it up to GitHub, that's going to trigger a workflow, and it's going to deploy my deploy my web application out into Azure. It's also going to go ahead and create the necessary service principals and GitHub secrets so that GitHub can authenticate itself with Azure. And generally, it's just going to remove that friction from us getting from some code locally in our machine to something that we can deploy through a CI/CD pipeline. So next up, we want to have a look at some of the new refactoring tools that are available here in Visual Studio. I'm going to switch over to another project here. We're going to use the solar system project. Doesn't really matter what this application does. The important thing here is that there's some code in here that is kind of cyclomatically complex. There's lots of iterations, lots of variable reassignments happening, and we want to kind of have an idea of what's going on. So even if we just look at this for loop right here in the middle, we can see we're kind of iterating over this integer. We've got this variable called day. We know that there's some mutation and there's some value assessments happening throughout this code. And one of the things that we've done in Visual Studio is introduce some tools to help us understand and visualize this behavior. So the first thing that we can do is enable underline of value reassignment. Let's scroll all the way down here. Underline reassigned value variables, sorry. If you install Visual Studio 22 today, this is going to be enabled by default. So you won't have to go through this options view. And the first thing that we can see here, if I just zoom in a little bit, is wherever there is a value or a variable reassignment, we're going to underline that variable for you so that we can immediately see that there is some mutation happening and that it's being accessed at a later point in the code. So it's just giving us a heads up to say, hey, just to let you know something is changing here. Now there's not necessarily anything wrong with this code, but it just helps us to understand kind of where that mutation is happening, particularly as we start writing more functional code across the .NET framework. The other thing that we can do is we can go ahead and right-click this variable, and we can say track value source. And this is essentially going to take a look at the code that we've got here and help us visualize wherever this variable is accessed and wherever this variable is mutated. And we can go ahead and expand this. We can have a look at the for loop, and we can navigate directly to that piece of code. Now this example here is a for loop. We increment it, and then we do some, we have a condition there on this piece. But we can imagine as we start to scale this up to other scenarios where we have further mutations and other logical behaviors based on those variables, from going from 100 lines of C# to a hierarchy tree on the right-hand side there, makes it a lot easier for us to understand what's happening. Also in .NET 6, we launched Hot Reload, the ability for us to reload our applications without having to recompile the whole application, without us having to reload the entire application. And we've got native support for that, as you would expect, in Visual Studio as well. If we jump over here into our Blazor application, and we go ahead and run this, I'm sure that if you've seen any Blazor-related demo in the past, you will have seen this application. It's the same application that you're going to get. That's not the Blazor application. Let's try that again. It's the same application that we're going to get if you go File, New Blazor application, whether that's client-side or server-side Blazor. We'll have that application running in a second. Just thinking about it. Here we go, Blazor application. And kind of our typical developer in a loop is that we're going to hit F5 or we're going to hit run. We're going to go and debug it. We're going to go and check our application. And then we're going to close it. We're going to go and make some changes, and we're going to go through that cycle again. Adds time, adds complexity. With hot reload, we have the ability to bring these two things up side by side and make changes in real time without having to recompile the entire application. That's an interesting ratio. Let's bring that over a little bit. Cool. Okay, so let's jump into the code here. We can make some relatively straightforward changes to kick us off today. We could just change our header here to say this is a test. We could go and save that. And then over here, we can see this little fire icon that we've got to say that we're going to do a hot reload. And we can make a quick change there. And that's going to hot reload the application over on the right. Now, that's a relatively straightforward change. We're just changing some HTML that's rendered in the browser there. What else can we do with this? We can jump over into a component here that we've got called counter. And we can see here that as we start clicking this, it's going to start incrementing our counter. Now let's go and have a look at the code for this particular component. You can see here that we've got a little bit of HTML expressed in this Razor file, and we've also got some inline C# code here. Now it's worth noting this C# code is compiled. It's compiled code. We're going to do just-in-time compilation for this so that when we click this button over here on the right-hand side, something happens. Now let's go and change this code. Let's do a current count. Instead of incrementing by 1, let's go ahead and do a current count plus 10. And we'll save this. And again, let's go and hot reload this. You'll see the little tick tells us that it's been hot reloaded on the right-hand side, but the number 12 has stayed the same. So despite the fact that we're refreshing the application, we're persisting the state of the application over there on the right-hand side. And now when we start clicking, we're now incrementing by 10 instead of 1. Now this is a fairly trivial example. We've got one variable there. This works for CRUD applications, whether we've got inline web forms, whether we're rendering data out into tables, all the way through to complex data types. Just to kind of show you this in a bit more detail as well, we can jump back to our home page. We can go and drop a counter component on the home page there. I'm actually going to configure Visual Studio to do a hot reload on file save so that I don't have to keep pushing that button. And we'll go and save that. Counter appears on the right-hand side. Let's go and increment that. We can go and put another counter on the screen there. And hot reload is going to respect the state of both of those components respectively. Again, we can go and change some code here. Let's do a -5 instead. And now both of those components are going to respect and honor that code change. Looks simple, looks easy. As a developer working on very large code bases, this saves us a huge amount of time. The ability for us not to have to do this, stop, make a change, run, and the ability for us to hot reload that compile change in real time is a huge productivity win. The final thing that I want to show you here on modern application development is our cross-platform capability for remote execution and for unit tests. For this particular demo, we're going to jump over here into the most simple unit test that you've ever seen, unless you're one of the developers that write assert true equals true. But we've got two unit tests here. One that is going to pass when we're running on Windows, and the other one that's going to pass when we're running on Linux. And if we go and have a look at our tests, we can say run all tests. And we can expand this out. And as we would expect, one of those tests has passed, and one of those tests has failed. I'm running Windows 11 here. The one that's passed is the one we would expect it to, Windows. On my machine, I also have the Windows subsystem for Linux. We can see here that I have Ubuntu 20.04, and in that Ubuntu machine, I also have .NET 6 installed as well. And over here in Visual Studio, we have the ability to configure what we call remote test environments. And we can see that I've configured one here, WSL Ubuntu. This could also be an SSH connection to a remote virtual machine with whatever distribution of Linux we wish. And when we go and run our unit tests, we have the ability to choose the environment that we want Visual Studio to go and run these tests in. So we can go and say, hey, go and take this code and run it in Ubuntu for me. It's going to take a second for it to think about that. And then we can go and run the tests. And as we would expect, our Linux test is now going to pass and our Windows test is going to fail. The reason that this is so important is that the majority of .NET developers today are developing their code on Windows in Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code, and then they're deploying that code into a .NET runtime that's running on Linux. Over half of customer virtual machines in Azure are Linux, and that's where our customers are running their .NET workloads. So it's imperative that we actually start testing our applications predominantly in Linux environments so that we have the closest match to our production environments. Cool, okay. Let's jump back and talk a little bit about productivity. Cool. So we want to talk about both personal and team productivity. And with this, we're going to have a bit of a skew or a bit of a focus towards performance, productivity, and security. The first thing that we want to talk about, and the one that I am most excited about, is that Visual Studio is finally a 64-bit application. Essentially where this comes from, Microsoft is fully aware of the size of applications that developers are building in Visual Studio. Visual Studio itself built in Visual Studio, Windows is built in Visual Studio, and some similarly sized projects across our customer and partner ecosystem as well. And for a long time, we've been optimizing and improving memory consumption and the performance of Visual Studio to help make it as quick and as performant as possible. We've taken services and components of Visual Studio and we've ran them out of process in order to get the most out of a 32-bit application. But fundamentally, it wasn't enough. Applications, the number of projects, the amount of code was growing far quicker than we could optimize the 32-bit version of Visual Studio. So with Visual Studio 2022, we now have a 64-bit version, which essentially means that Visual Studio can now take full advantage of all available system resources rather than being constrained by that 32-bit ecosystem. We've also made some other improvements across the product as well to help create a focus for developers and to help kind of narrow down the view that you have from that solution experience, that solution explorer. We've recently GA'd the ability to apply project filters so that we can only see the projects that we care about, that we're currently working on. And we're not only hiding the other projects, we're also dropping them out of memory so that Visual Studio doesn't have to worry about those particular projects at that time. We've also introduced some changes on the code indexing service. The idea here is to drive productivity in the developer's inner loop. This is going to allow you to refactor, navigate, and search code more performantly. Code search also allows us to now search code even if we don't have the source code pulled down to our local machine. We can go ahead and we can look at references and definitions for C# objects, whether we have the code or whether it's up in GitHub or whether it's over in Azure repos. And then finally, Visual Studio 2022, a big focus was about making every developer feel at home when they opened Visual Studio. Making code more accessible, making it feel more personal, and making sure that developers can configure and tailor their developer environment in a way that works for them and enables them to be productive. So we'll have a look at a couple more demos here. Let's do a quick switch over. Cool, back in Visual Studio. The first thing I'm going to show you is the least exciting demo in the world. I just want to show you that Visual Studio is running under 64-bit. We can jump over here into the details of our task manager, and assuming that I can scroll quicker than this refreshes, we've got Visual Studio installed here. Let me zoom in a little bit. Dev environment, I've got 4 instances of Visual Studio up and running, and we can see all 4 of these are running as 64-bit architecture. So in the past, what we've had is things like .NET and some kind of external extensions running as 64-bit, but the core dev environment has always been limited to a 32-bit architecture. This is no longer the case. as I mentioned, we now kind of have access to the full system resources. Told you, least exciting demo in the world. Task Explorer. Let's have a look at some of the other stuff that we were talking about. We're going to dive over into a console application here. Everybody's favorite thing, debugging code. We want to try and make it as easy and as straightforward as possible. One of the scenarios that's really common for developers is debugging recursive or iterative code. We would do something like this. We would put a breakpoint inside this for loop, and then when we go and run this code, let's set this as my startup, I can go and run this, and then I'm going to get that really annoying fatigue of having to press continue 5, 6, 7 times depending on what we're iterating over. So I can go and hit continue, then it's going to hit the breakpoint again. I can hit continue, it's going to hit the breakpoint again. And if we want to only debug a very particular piece of logic, this is very quickly going to start getting annoying. So one of the things that we introduced in Visual Studio 2022 is the idea of a temporary breakpoint. So I can go ahead and right-click this here and say Insert Temporary Breakpoint. What this essentially means is that once this breakpoint has been hit, we'll remove it. So we can now go ahead and debug the same application. We're going to hit that breakpoint. We can go and debug this, have a look at some variables, and then when I hit continue, the breakpoint is removed, the execution of my code continues. Now in my example here, I've just got a list of names. You can kind of imagine as we're iterating over hundreds or thousands of elements. This just makes our lives a little bit easier. It means that we can take our fingers off the F5 key for a little bit and just focus in on that piece of code. The other thing that we introduced was this idea of a conditional breakpoint, the idea that we only want a breakpoint to be hit under certain conditions. An example of what this might look like, we could put some code in here and say if I is even, then we can do a quick write line. And we can imagine a scenario here where we have a couple of breakpoints. But we only really care about the second breakpoint if the first one has been hit, if I evaluates as even. And one of the things that we can do again, we can go ahead and right-click, Insert Conditional Breakpoint. This is going to give us a couple of options. We can write a conditional expression, or we can say only enable this when the following breakpoint has been hit. We can go ahead and select that breakpoint, and we can then go and close this. We can see a little different icon that we've got there. This essentially tells us that this breakpoint is conditional. And now when we go and run this code, if I put my semicolon in there, room full of developers and nobody shouted semicolon. You all saw it. So there we go, the first one has been hit there, which means our second one is going to get hit. The next time we skipped over it, if I jump over here, we'll see it there, we skipped over it. So the idea of this conditional breakpoint. We can combine these as well. We could make this one a temporary breakpoint, which means that we're only going to hit this breakpoint the first time that we hit that conditional breakpoint at the beginning. So a few minor updates there to help kind of make our debugging experience a little bit better. Personalization, my favorite. I open Visual Studio and pretty much use the defaults 90% of the time. I think if somebody spent a bit of time making a color scheme, it's going to be a pretty decent one. But there are lots of developers out there that want to make their code more accessible, want to change the appearance and the behavior of their development environment so that they can be the most productive developer that they can be. We're going to look at a couple of features here. The first one, we're going to focus in on the tab bar at the top here. And let's open up some more stuff here so we get a few more things in the tab bar. The first thing that I'm going to go and do is enable colorization for our tabs. And I'm going to do colorization by project. And foolishly opened everything from the same project. And what we can see here as we zoom in at the top there, that depending on the project that particular code file comes from, we're going to group them by color. This is going to help us kind of navigate the code, help us understand what code it is that we're looking at and where that comes from. We can go one step further than this, and we can actually say, let's put these tabs on the left-hand side, which is great for those that are kind of spatial thinkers or those that have come from Visual Studio Code and just like to see everything listed on the left. And we can see that we've got all of these open tabs, and we've actually grouped them by project as well, whereas previously we just had this kind of jumbled mess of either alphabetically sorted, or we would sort them by which one you opened most recently, which was the worst experience in the world because it meant that the tabs kept moving around. Couple of other things that we want to talk about, particularly in terms of kind of code accessibility, reducing cognitive load for developers. Something really simple, line spacing. The amount of code that we see on a screen, the amount of white space that we see, we can go ahead and configure line spacing for our projects. I'm going to go and increase line spacing here to 2. And we can maximize that, and we can see that we've kind of increased line spacing. Now, for me as a developer, I want to see as much code on the screen as I can. You know, we don't go and buy 32-inch screens for no reason. But in terms of making code more accessible to more people around the world, increasing that line spacing and kind of reducing that cognitive load to make code more readable is a really valuable addition to Visual Studio. I'm going to bring our tabs back onto the top. And you may have noticed as I was kind of opening more tabs, I'm kind of limited by the real estate on my screen to the number of tabs that I have open here. One of the things that we launched or we made generally available in 17.3, so the most recent iteration of 2022, is the ability for us to stack tabs. So there we go. So we can say show tabs in multiple rows, and we can click OK there, and we can see we've kind of got those multiple rows here for the ability for us to see all of the tabs that we have open. One of the nice features that we also released fairly recently in 2022 is the ability to restore recently closed tabs. Let's say I'm working on our catalog context here and I accidentally go and close it. Sounds silly, but it happens all the time, trust me. Something as simple as restore closed tab, the ability for me to bring that tab back into context. And it's also going to kind of bring us back to the point in that code that we were working on as well, which is a nice little addition. The final thing that we want to talk about in terms of personalization is theming. Like I mentioned, I'm going to go with the defaults. I don't like light mode, I like dark mode. It works really well for me. But one of the things we introduced in Visual Studio 2022 is the ability to import themes from VS Code, where we had a huge ecosystem of themes that had been created by various partners and developers around the world. We wanted to kind of steal all of that and bring it into the full-fat version of Visual Studio. So if we go ahead and have a look at some of the extensions that we've got installed here, have a look at my installed extensions, we can see that I've installed the Visual Studio theme pack. This is created by the Microsoft DevLab team. And this essentially just brings in, I think it's like the top 10, 15 themes that are used across Visual Studio Code. So if we jump into our tooling, have a look at themes, instead of just light and dark, I think we used to have light, dark, and blue, which was very random. We now get a whole host of ones. Let's go and make Visual Studio red. Show of hands if you use a red Visual Studio on a daily basis. No, I didn't think so either. That's pretty terrible. But we could go ahead and we can, let's go for something a little bit more, let's go with Solarized Dark. I'm sure that's all right. Yeah, not bad. And we can go ahead and we can get more. We can go and install themes now from the marketplace. We can go and have a look at themes, get more themes. Let's go and make that bigger. And we now have a whole host of themes that we can go and choose. And as I mentioned, we have the tooling in place for developers to go into Visual Studio Code, find a theme that they like, import that into the Visual Studio Marketplace and make that available for VS 2022 as well. I'm going to change that back because it gives me heart palpitations. Let's go for dark. There we go. And then finally, we want to talk about kind of collaboration. We call it collaboration. I'm going to talk about Git and kind of the source code experience that we have in Visual Studio. In terms of collaboration and innovations that we've made in this space, we have rebuilt the Git experience from the ground up. So previously it had some kind of legacy from the TSVC days, and for people that were Git native developers, they would open up the source control window and be a little bit lost. Things didn't always make a lot of sense because we had a lot of that legacy sat in there as well. So we rebuilt it from the ground up, very much influenced from VS Code's Git experience, and we've also recently introduced this over onto Visual Studio 2022 for Mac as well. We'll skip over actionable diagnostics. We talked a little bit about that around when we were looking at some of the debugging stuff, but the third thing on here around kind of AI assistance in Visual Studio Code. I'm sure many of you have heard of IntelliSense, that helpful utility in Visual Studio that pops up and gives us all of the symbols and objects that we want. Visual Studio 2022 introduces something called IntelliCode. This is essentially IntelliSense with a bit of AI, because AI makes everything better. And essentially what this does, two things. It scans common code that's available out on GitHub and openly available online, and it creates a model of recognizable code completion. What this means is that as we start writing code in Visual Studio, instead of just getting the next symbol or the next dot property, Visual Studio is going to give us full line completion as well, so we can hit tab and auto-complete the whole line of code, essentially making us all very lazy. Also, it's going to take that whole list of properties that IntelliSense gives us, and it's going to recommend the ones that it thinks we are most likely to use next, based on common coding patterns. Furthermore, IntelliCode can actually go and scan our own code bases in our organizations and learn the habits and practices of our own developers and start giving us recommendations to drive consistency across the code base. Now, before we dive into some demos on the Git side, I do want to quickly distinguish IntelliCode is not GitHub Copilot. These are two separate products. If you install GitHub Copilot into Visual Studio, it's going to disable IntelliCode. They don't work in conjunction with each other. Let's talk about Git. As I mentioned, we rebuilt Git tooling from the ground up. This is to kind of help developers to get started with the onboarding experience in terms of initializing, cloning down existing repositories. It's going to help developers to collaborate on code. It's going to help developers to understand Git branching and pull requests natively here in the IDE. One of my favorite features is the multi-repo support as organizations start building out microservices and discrete services, and we want to start pushing those into separate repositories. It makes our debug experience much more difficult. We've got multiple instances of Visual Studio, one with the UI, one with the backend, one with the kind of the data access layer, and it becomes very difficult for us to bring those things together. With multi-repo support, we can bring multiple Git repositories into a single Visual Studio solution and work on those kind of within an integrated development environment. Let's go and have a look. Let's jump over to our calculator application. So for this particular project, we have, or this particular solution, sorry, we have two projects. We have a calculator. You can't see my screen. Nobody's shouting. Nobody told me about the semicolon. Nobody told me about the desktop. I thought we were a team. Here we go. You see some code. I'm also going to get rid of that line spacing because it means that we can't see very much. Let's do line spacing. Okay, we see some code. Okay, so we have two projects in this solution, a calculator and then a maths library. And if we go ahead and open this in the terminal, let's do File Explorer. Can we see it here? No, let's bring it up in here. Let's go and have a look at the calculator. We can see that we've got the calculator and the mathlib directory. If we go and have a look at the calculator, -A, let's do it the other way. Let's do here. How do we get Explorer to show us hidden files these days? Okay, we can see that the math library is initialized with a Git directory. and as is the calculator initialized with a Git directory. So typically we would have a .git in the root of our in the root of our solution. In this particular example, each of the projects are their own independent Git repository. And we can actually see this as well if we go and have a look at the Git Explorer here in Visual Studio. It's telling us that there are 2 repositories registered. And if we go and open this, we can see that we have both the calculator and the math lib are highlighted in bold, which means both of these are in the current context of Visual Studio. We can go and have a look at Git changes, and we can go ahead and look at branches. And here in Visual Studio, we're going to see both of those repositories side by side. We can have a look at the branches that are available. We can have a look at the change history as well. But one of the biggest changes that we've made here is the ability for us to commit changes to both of these repositories concurrently. So we can go ahead and make a change in this solution. Let's go and have a look at our maths library here and go and implement this particular method. We can say first number, there we go, IntelliCode, giving us that full line completion rather than the next thing. I don't know how, but it knows what I want to do, so I'm going to hit tab. I'll never understand how AI works, but I get full line code completion, so I'm happy. First number times second number. We can now jump over into our calculator project and we can go and use that method. We can say simple math.multiplication. In fact, let me just go back a little bit there. We can see that little star symbol next to each of these symbols. This is IntelliCode again, saying these are the things that I think you're going to want to use, rather than here's everything in an alphabetical list. So again, we can go ahead and do multiplication, and we'll do first number, second number there. Now I've made a fairly simple change across 2 projects, across 2 code files. In the real world, in a kind of a typical N-tier application, I'm likely going to have changed something in the UI, something in my business logic, maybe something in the data access layer, might have updated some unit tests across a number of different projects. And we can now jump over into our Git Changes Explorer, and it's going to show us these changes as if it was a single Git repository. It's going to say you made a change to the program and you made a change to the simple maths code file as well. We can go ahead and we can have a look at those changes as you would expect and compare those side by side. Something else that we launched in 17.3 is the ability for us to stage a single line of code. So rather than staging an entire file into our Git repository, we have the option here just to click that click the plus here and stage just that line of code from this file into the next Git commit. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to commit this change. We can see at the top that I am currently committing to multiple repositories. You see multiple up here. And I'm going to say implemented multiplication. I'm going to stage all of my files and commit all repos. And we can see at the top it's now going to give me the Git hash for 2 separate repositories. That's 2 commits over 2 projects. And if we go back and have a look at the Git Explorer here, we can see implementing multiplication in this particular repository. And if we skip over to this branch here as well, we can see the same commit on that repo as well. And I now have the ability to go and push this up into the 2 respective Git repositories in Azure DevOps, GitHub, Bitbucket, wherever it might be. So making our lives a little bit easier, particularly as we start moving towards kind of this multi-repo development environment across microservices or discrete components. So with that, I think we are just on time to open up the floor to some Q&A. I'm going to jump over here with some links. If you want to download Visual Studio 2022, links at the top there. If you've never seen Visual Studio 2022 or Visual Studio at all before, this would have been an interesting session for you. But there's a link at the bottom there to help you get started. And there's also a link on there to kind of walk through what's new, which gives you kind of some documentation links for some of the stuff that we've talked about today. I'm going to leave that up. I'm going to get my cup of water off the floor. And if there's any questions, I think there's a mic, or you can shout. I think there's enough of us in here to hear each other. But if you have got any questions, I think we've got a few minutes to answer any questions. If not, I'm around for the rest of the day. Come and grab me. Yes?
Hi. Are there what scenarios does
Does it not work?
Yeah, I mean, I can see the advantages
Mm-hmm.
and efficiencies.
Yep.
But I was just thinking, is there a limit to
Yep.
where hot reload has to switch to the usual compile cycle?
Yes, definitely. If we change object types, if we change from a float to a double, or if we change from a string to an array of characters, it's going to break because it doesn't understand how to maintain the state across that particular change. But other than that, it is fairly flexible. One thing I will note is that this is .NET 6, so it's going to work for all project types in .NET 6. It's not going to work in web forms, for example.
So you can add code as long as you don't change objects and types.
Yep. Yep.
Also doesn't work for async and link. If you make modifications in async code, it doesn't work there.
If you are midway through the execution, yeah. Yep.
Thank you.
Yes, question at the back there.
Multi-repos.
Mhm.
Should that work automatically in Visual Studio 2022, or do you have to? Is there a setting somewhere you have to say I'm going to use multi-repos?
It should be there by default.
Okay.
Yep. If you open a solution and that solution references projects, it's going to scan for all of the Git directories in there, and yeah, it should find them.
Check, and I might have a question for you later.
Yeah, sure. It might be that you're running 17.1, so at that point it was preview and opt-in. 17.2 enabled it by default.
What if I'm having I'm trying to get this right, a solution that references multiple repos? I assume it relies on the folder structure being the same, because if I check it out and my colleague checks it out the same, how does it find the other
Yep.
project folders?
Yeah, great question. So it relies on you having cloned all the respective repositories down to your machine. It's not, you can't open a solution and it will go and clone all the repos for you. But in terms of the folder structure, because each directory is handled as its own Git repo, each repository will have a different folder structure because it's a separate collection of code.
But you only have one solution file though, don't you?
Yes, correct.
So that solution file identifies where the projects are, so those projects have got to be located equivalently.
Yeah. It's commonly used in conjunction with Git submodules, which kind of gives you the ability to go and clone submodules down at the same time. But yeah, the most common use case I would say is ad hoc debugging rather than kind of your default development model. The ability is I need to go and debug something, almost the equivalent of we used to do kind of code sharing between projects, and we used to load code in dynamically using the CSproj file. It's essentially a more modern way of doing that. Yep.
For the breakpoints, so you have the temporary breakpoint. Is there a concept of fire it once in a debug session? Because I would find that useful, but not necessarily that the breakpoint hits once and then I have to add the breakpoint back in. That isn't something you've got, is it?
So we can put a condition on the breakpoint to say only increment when I is 0, for example.
Say hit once
No.
and then,
No.
So could I potentially raise a feature request?
Yep, absolutely. Yep. I'm going to do the same as everybody at Microsoft and say feedback button here in the top right. You'll get to the product teams much quicker than I can. But yeah, it's a great shout, kind of that idea of almost a transient breakpoint rather than a temporary breakpoint.
And there was something, I'd like you to see if you can reproduce a bug. Can you start a file that potentially has some unused usings at the top?
Yeah, let me go to eShop on web because that's usually, there you go.
Can you remove and sort?
Can I do what, sorry?
Remove and sort usings and see if it actually does remove the unused ones. Because that seems to be broken in 2022 for me.
It wasn't a particular version. It's not one version anymore, is it?
Oh, so you don't have remove, maybe that's a resharper thing. Remove and sort.
Yeah, I don't think that's native to Visual Studio. I think that's a resharper.
So that's a resharper bug then.
Yes. So the solution to that is uninstall resharper.
It's really hard sometimes to tell which thing resharper is adding in and which isn't.
If your CPU fan goes crazy, it's ReSharper. There you go, I'll remove them for you. So yeah, no, I can't reproduce that bug, I'm afraid. Any more for any more? Yes?
Fairly quick one, is there colorized brackets without using a third-party extension?
No. I don't know, I agree, I think that would be a pretty cool addition, but no, it's not available at the moment.
Because even some of the third-party extensions wouldn't work in Visual Studio 2022 edition.
Yeah. Yeah, it's something that they've got over on VS Code. In terms of personalization, we can see Visual Studio starting to steal a lot from VS Code, so I imagine it's not far away. We have kind of the line that kind of gives us that indentation to link together curly braces, but not the colorization, no. Yeah, I agree. It would be cool to have. Yes?
So I currently use VS Code. Do I need to download VS 2022 like separately?
Yes. Yep. It is separately licensed, separately downloaded, and is generally a much larger install than Visual Studio Code. Yep. I see no more hands. What we'll do, we'll wrap up there. I'm going to be around for the break. I'll be around at lunchtime as well. If you've got any other questions, come and grab me as I start to pack away, or as you see me around for the rest of today. Yes, go on.
Quick one with the colorized tabs on that. How do you know which color it's related to on the right-hand side Solution Explorer?
No.
It's not linked.
Nope. Yeah, unfortunately not. That would be nice. The nearest that we've got to that is bringing the tabs on the left-hand side. And if I zoom in there, we can kind of see it names the project and then groups all the tabs together.
It's got multiple inside of it.
Yep. Yep. I suspect it's something that they wanted to do, but due to the architecture of how Visual Studio works, all of these things are separate products in the background. It makes it pretty difficult to bring all that together. Yep.
Can you still enable shouty menus?
Yes, you can.
I did that in 2019. I actually quite like shouty menus, whereas everybody else seems to hate them.
For everyone else's benefit, that's menus in caps lock. In Visual Studio 2019, our user experience team thought it'd be a good idea for all of these menus at the top to be in caps lock. No idea why. It was a design decision, but quite rightly we dropped it in 2022. But yes, you can still enable it randomly. And actually there's an Easter egg in Visual Studio as well where you can make everything caps lock. Again, I don't know why. So we'll wrap up there. I'm going to close down. As I said, if you've got any other questions, come and grab me at some point. I hope you enjoy the rest of the day. And again, welcome back to TVP. Thanks, everybody.